before, and an awful lot has been changing in that period. So what I suggest, maybe I'll kind of start off by giving my sort of standard definition of fascism. And then I suggest let's make it kind of much more of an open discussion. So at that point, if anybody wants to bring up, any aspect I haven't brought up, I mean, I'm bound to leave a lot of stuff out. You may, of course, simply disagree with me, and that's great. Feel free to throw whatever tomatoes you want. In fact, I'd be delighted if you pick some holes in my definition, because hopefully that'll get me to improve it a bit so on as time goes by. But I thought kind of as an added bonus, before we got to any of that, well, I tried to be a sort of go the extra mile kind of professor. So I thought kind of as a little added bonus for you guys, before we even get to all the history and politics stuff, I'd like to revolutionize your understanding of biology. So kind of brace yourselves, guys. I mean, this is going to change your lives. So, okay. A dog is not a man. It makes a lot of sense, right? I mean, after all, a cow is a man. A dog is not a cow. Therefore, a dog is not a man. Everything I've just said is actually a complete load of old rubbish. Why is it a complete load of old rubbish?
A false potency between mammal and cow?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, something can very well be a mammal without also being a cow. So I guess I'm clearly a little bit confused, because of course you could have many different mammals and they might all be rather different from each other. They don't all have to be a cow, but nonetheless they do all have something fundamentally in common which allows us to classify them all as cows. So I'm clearly a little bit confused. And to tell the truth, I'm not the only one who's confused, because if you try and get a definition of fascism, you run into this really weird thing. I mean, I don't know if this has been your experience, but I find on the one hand, if you read like books on like definitions of fascism, you have this incredible conflict between lots of different wise old professors who all have their own theories. They all see huge flaws in each other's theories, and there's no real agreement. And some professors get into, if you'll pardon the expression, whining that we will never find the holy grail of a true definition of fascism. But at the same time, I tend to find that most people kind of know what it is. Like, I mean, I've had one of my favourite TV shows recently was one of those Star Wars shows, Andor. Has anybody seen that? And I love it. I think it's great. And I mean, and I hear a lot of people say kind of Andor is clearly an allegory for fascism. In fact, I think the author of it actually admitted that pretty much publicly. And nobody seems to have any difficulty in understanding kind of what he means by that. So why do we have this kind of weird sort of schizophrenic notion of fascism? And I think this is worth talking about. I think this has actually become quite important recently. I mean, when was like, what's the first time you had like a political movement, a political party, or a political regime that actually calls itself fascist, actually uses the term?
Was it in Italy? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, so it goes back to 1919. You've got Benito Mussolini forms what at first is like one of many cranky little splinter groups on the extreme right of Italian politics, and he actually calls it a fascist party. And in fact, I mean, the name actually comes from an Italian word fascio, which actually means, it just means league. I mean, initially it wasn't particularly radical right-wing. A lot of different organisations of all kinds of political complexions call themselves like a fascio in Italy. And also, there's also an object which is a symbol which is called a fasciste. And that's, you guys know what that looks like? Yeah, so yeah, it's like the bundle of sticks, which is all then tied together, and there's an axe at the top. So the idea is individually the sticks are weak, but if they're tied together, they're strong. So unity is strength. And at the top of it, you usually have an axe as well, which kind of signifies you're holding it together through force, or the threat of force and so on. And this actually becomes the big symbol of like the fascist regime. But ironically, if you look at, say, at statues of George Washington and so on, you'll see him with this fascist symbol as well. Like in like the French Republic and so on, like a lot of the kind of symbolism uses this. So there was actually nothing initially kind of, fascisty about it, but it's very much acquired this meaning. So the first kind of like recognisable party you have is Mussolini's fascist party, which eventually from like 1922 onwards gradually becomes the fascist regime and so on. Now, it's not the only country where this is happening. I mean, it's a very sad time for democracy in Europe in general. basically after World War I, a lot of new countries get created, the old empires break up. You've already got a lot of democracies kind of mostly in the West, like Britain, France, Scandinavia, those kinds of places. And now you suddenly have a lot of new democracies, because new countries get created, and partly due to the influence like Woodrow Wilson's kind of idealism and so on. Initially, they're all set up with democratic constitutions, at least in theory. However, this doesn't last. I mean, throughout like the 1920s and the 1930s, more and more of these regimes succumb to some kind of authoritarianism and so on. Now, over in the East, of course, you've already got the Soviet Union, or what becomes the Soviet Union, and that's like a radical communist regime. How that relates to fascism is another interesting question that maybe we can talk about. But basically, everywhere else, what happens is democracy gets replaced by some kind of nationalist authoritarian regime. And I think what pretty much happens is the way we get to like a general definition of fascism is people look around at Europe, they see that Italy is one of the first, not quite the absolute first, but it's one of the first countries where this happens, you know, where democracy gets replaced by nationalist authoritarianism. And people then start saying, okay, so we need a general word for nationalist authoritarianism, so let's call it fascism, because that's the most famous example. Because bear in mind, Nazism isn't around yet, that's going to come in the 1930s. And to be honest, I think that's just great. Nice and simple, right? Okay, so basically there are two things you need to be fascist. You need nationalism, and you need authoritarianism. And, okay, now I'll maybe be a little more precise about nationalism, maybe. Like, when we talk about nationalism, we're not kind of meaning sort of civic nationalism, where anybody who wants to join the nation can. It's always somehow defined by something that excludes certain other people and so on. So it's got, I guess, some kind of ethnic nationalism, although the way that's defined varies a lot. And on the other hand, you've got authoritarianism, and that can take all kinds of forms. And usually the leaders of fascism themselves don't actually quite know what they're going to end up with. I mean, there's no like kind of blueprint for fascism and so on. But yes, it's got back to life. It's very simple. We have a nice, convenient word for nationalist authoritarianism. It's clearly very useful for describing Europe for quite some time. And you could arguably extend it to, say, Japan and to parts of Latin America, other places too. The trouble is people just don't know when they have a good thing. So for a start, like, it tends to be people kind of on the left who start using fascism that way, although not exclusively. And some people on the left, particularly those who are connected to the Soviet Union, start basically extending the use of the term until it becomes ridiculous. So for example, in Germany, you've got the Social Democrats, who are these kind of left-wing, a bit socialistic, but very committed to the Weimar Republic. But Stalin doesn't like them, so the German communists don't like them, so he decides they're actually also fascists. Although they're supporting democracy in Germany, objectively they're fascist, because if they're anti-communist, they're actually fascists. So it sort of degenerates into a word that is just basically a word used for anyone you don't like. And I think that's kind of, you get a bit of backlash from that, because I think historians then become very skeptical about this kind of overuse of the term applying to everything. So they get incredibly finicky. Like, they basically say, okay, to be real fascism, you've got to have a very precise number of characteristics. Like, there's a book by Stanley Payne, which I always set as like the course text when I teach this, partly because it's full of great information. I don't like his overall conclusion too much. And he's basically got this checklist of about 250, well, it's a slight exaggeration. You've got a checklist of about 20 points you have to fulfill to be a true fascist. And as far as he's concerned, the true fascists are basically Mussolini's Italy, Hitler's Germany, and about 2 crazy guys in Romania. And anything else, any other kind of authoritarian regime, he would say, is just some kind of conservative authoritarian regime. He thinks there has to be something somehow revolutionary about fascism for it to qualify as fascism. I think the trouble is that way. I mean, it's a lot of fun coming up with these pessimistic definitions of fascism, and it's great for selling books because you can reclaim the next contribution to the debate and so on. But it becomes pretty much useless, because if fascism is only Mussolini's Italy and Hitler's Germany, and as I think pretty much everyone would admit, there are actually huge differences between Hitler's Germany and Italian fascism, just in terms of like Nazi Germany goes far further than that. then basically the term becomes useless, or it becomes like a little piece, a little thing you can put in a box marked history, and put away in the corner and forget all about it. And I think that's incredibly dangerous, because like fascism, I think, was like the big bad wolf in many ways. And we knew what the wolf was, we had a name for it. But then we started arguing over what colour fur the wolf had to be to actually be a wolf. And so maybe if the wolf comes back one day, and some might say the wolf has definitely come back, we're still arguing over whether it really qualifies as a wolf, because maybe its fur is like a slightly different colour from the wolves we've seen before. Yeah, so I would say, like, I would certainly say Hitler is a fascist, absolutely. Like I say, Hitler and the Nazi regime is the most extreme example of fascism by almost any criteria. Like the most violent, the most destructive. I mean, the only regime that kind of killed the same number of people as him is maybe Stalin's Russia. And in fact, Stalin was in power for a much longer period. If you focus purely on the period of World War II, where Hitler was unconstrained completely, he killed even more people than the Soviet Union. The Holocaust, but far more than that. And so, but the fact that Hitler is so bad doesn't mean that no one else is a fascist. Like, I mean, it's a bit like saying, you know, a dog is not a mammal because a cow is a mammal. Like, Hitler is the very extreme cow, I suppose, or a wild bull, I guess. But there's still plenty of room for other kinds of mammals. And to be honest, if the only kind of fascist is Hitler, then Mussolini probably wasn't a Nazi, because he wasn't a fascist either, because he was nothing like as extreme as Hitler in some ways. So it's kind of like, if you basically say that a fascist has to be like Hitler, you basically are making it impossible to ever call anyone a fascist. And I think that's actually become very dangerous of late, because we're now in a lot of countries, and we don't really feel comfortable calling it a wolf anymore. Kind of quite like, well, it's not exactly Hitler, so it can't really be fascism at all. I think that's pretty wrong. So I guess really I've already given you what my definition of fascism. It's sort of nationalism of a kind that sort of, like, if you're a fascist, the nation is the highest source of loyalty. There is nothing higher than the nation. That for me is what differentiates it from, say, sort of Stalinism. I think because however terrible Stalin was, in theory, he was always aiming to improve the situation of the whole world. Like, he was working for the tribe of the working class across the world. And however much he kind of really got lost from that, ultimately he did have this kind of aspiration to help the whole human race. Fascists are not interested in the whole human race. They're interested in one subsection of the human race, their nation. I mean, they might recognise that there are other great nations across the world, but that doesn't necessarily mean they actually like them. I mean, I would say, to be a fascist, you don't have to say you're a fascist to be a fascist. In fact, most of you don't. You don't have to think you're a fascist to be a fascist. You don't have to like other fascists to be a fascist, because since you believe in your nation above all, then your very worst enemies might be fascists in other countries for whom their nation is above all. So that's one. So basically, fascists tend to believe their nation is the only source of loyalty. Nothing can compete. There's class conflict is nonsense. You know, you can't be loyal to your class before the nation. Any kind of universal religion is actually also nonsense, because it's a loyalty that kind of goes above the nation. And so the nation is it. But the nation usually, as far as fascists are concerned, the nation has fallen into decline. It's in decadence. It's it had a glorious past, and it's a shadow of its former self. And there are usually a lot of reasons fascists give for that. But almost inevitably, it turns out that there are kind of treacherous, disloyal elements within the nation itself who kind of betrayed the nation and brought it down. You've also got kind of other nations have kind of often worked to kind of deprive your nation of its rights and so on, but they're also focused on the traitors with it. So no fascist believes that everybody who has a passport and works for a living deserves citizenship. I mean, like truly belonging to the nation, you're tied to an ethnic. So, who are the enemies? I mean, well, some people sometimes say Nazism was different from Italian fascism, because German Nazism was racist and Italian fascism wasn't really racist. That is nonsense. it's certainly true that Hitler was particularly fanatical about anti-Semitism and so on. I mean, not even all German Nazis were personally as extreme as he was. I mean, he had a particular hatred of Jewish people, blaming him for everything he found had gone wrong in the world since Germany lost World War One. But Mussolini is racist too. I mean, for a start, he's anti-black racist, like almost any European was. I mean, look at what Mussolini did invading Ethiopia, used kind of chemical weapons, extremely cruel occupation policy, same in Libya, by the way, which is also Italian colonial territory. And Mussolini was also very racist in the sense of he was no fan, ironically, of like the ethnic German minorities who live up in the south of Italy. I mean, to this day, you can meet a lot of guys at some kind of international student night, they look like Arnold Schwarzenegger and sound like Arnold Schwarzenegger. You ask them what country they come from, they say, oh, I come from Italy, because they're kind of living in these kind of northern areas that used to belong to like Austria back in the day. And Mussolini had no patience with these kind of national minorities who was trying to suppress them, which for a while, actually, ironically, was a potential source of conflict with Hitler. But in the end, Hitler was prepared to let those areas go because he had bigger plans in other places. So I mean, I would say every fascist is racist. I mean, it's not precisely the same thing in every case, but is racism ever really a very precise term anyway? And, there's always kind of xenophobia. And then of course there's Jewish people. I mean, almost all fascists kind of regard Jews as one of the great enemies. You know, maybe the great enemy. For Hitler, no doubt. I mean, as far as Hitler was concerned, the Jews were somehow behind communism and behind capitalism as well. It was a very strange. Once you kind of accept that view of the world, it kind of explains everything, which is kind of what's dangerous about it. Interestingly enough, there's one fascist league. I mean, a lot of the others were also very anti-Semitic. Romanian fascists were very anti-Semitic. The one fascist leader who wasn't so anti-Semitic for the first time, at least for the first few years, who was that? Well, actually, that's true. I mean, I guess that's a slightly later period, I suppose, because Japan kind of evolved into what I call a kind of fascism over a pretty long period. I mean, it's sort of in the 1920s, Japan is still kind of constitutional, kind of democracy, and basically the military kind of gradually takes over in a weird kind of way and so on. But say, the 1920s and early 30s, what kind of famous fascist leader is actually not showing any particular signs of being anti-Semitic?
Spanish one, I can't remember his name.
Oh, General Franco. Yeah, I mean, he wasn't that big. There wasn't that much anti-Semitism in Spain. Why wasn't there much anti-Semitism in Spain?
Not a lot of Jews.
Yeah. Basically, they'd kicked out their entire Jewish population, like back in the 1400s. I, however, shouldn't sound too high and mighty because we Brits kicked out our Jewish population kind of about a century before that. In fact, they only were let back into Britain because we had Oliver Cromwell, who was an exceptionally radical leader of a temporary revolutionary regime, and he let Jewish people back in. Otherwise, we might never have let them back in, or at least not until much later. Yeah, so you're right. So Franco, he was very pro-Catholic, so I guess it was like a sort of implicit anti-Semitic. It wasn't a big deal. But what other fascist leader wasn't showing any particular signs of being anti-Semitic before, up to the first part of the 1930s? Go for it.
Is it Tito from?
Oh, Tito's interesting. Tito actually is a communist leader. He's fighting against the Nazis in World War II. I mean, eventually, actually, he kind of breaks off from like international communism to some extent. So he breaks off from the Soviet Union. So he's an interesting case. But think more like the 1920s and the 1930s. What fascist leader is not showing any particular signs of being anti-Semitic? Mussolini. Crazy. I mean, Mussolini actually had a Jewish girlfriend who gave him a lot of his ideas. I mean, if anything, Jewish people were slightly overrepresented in the fascist party in its earliest, which is not to say that Mussolini had some kind of love of Jewish people or some kind of belief in tolerance for the sake of it. I think he felt they could be useful to him. So if Jews could be useful, great. Later on, if imitating Hitler and imitating Hitler's anti-Jewish laws could help him, that was great too. So once it became clear Hitler was making such a thing of anti-Semitism, he was very prepared to follow suit. But, so I guess it does mean though, like, you can't really see anti-Semitism as necessarily part of the absolute core definition of all fascism, but racism, yes, xenophobia in a general sense. Yeah. Yes, so that's one. So you've got kind of like anybody who's ethnically different is basically an enemy. It doesn't mean, by the way, that every fascist regime necessarily wants to kill. Like, I mean, Mussolini was more about, he didn't tend to kill massive numbers of people in Italy. Some people definitely. I mean, he was not a nice regime, but most of the killing he did was like in Ethiopia and places like that, or indeed in World War II. But I mean, Italian fascism was actually comparatively mild in some respects compared to other kinds of fascism. So you've got this weird situation where, like, the guy who's seen as being the absolute model of fascism in some ways is a relatively moderate example of it. And I think what's happened is Mussolini was just very radical in his style. Like, he had a certain way of presenting himself as being very new and so on. And it convinced a lot of people. I mean, for a while, it was Winston Churchill thought Mussolini was like a great leader who'd come to save Italy. And he kind of projects this image as being very futuristic, not backward-looking. All those marching people in the uniforms looks impressive. And Mussolini talks a big talk about revolution. But in fact, his regime is just one big compromise with the existing kind of conservative authoritarians and so on. So, I mean, to be honest, some of the nastiest fascists are actually relatively conservative ones. Like Franco, he killed far more people in Spain than Mussolini killed in Italy. I think there is one group of fascists in one country who it could be argued were as bad as the Nazis, given their relative resources. Does anybody happen to know who those were? Like, what might be the only fascist movement in Europe before 1945, which in terms of like the number of people it killed and brutalised relative to the resources it had, were actually as bad as the Nazis? Who might that be? Go for it.
Croatian Ustasha.
Croats, yeah. Yeah, you know, just this little part of Yugoslavia and so on. I mean, the Croats kind of got unified into Yugoslavia after World War I, and they were never, some of them at least were never entirely happy with that. So when Hitler came in and conquered Yugoslavia, they were only too happy to form their own kind of pro-Nazi state. They did some incredibly nasty things to anyone who wasn't a Catholic, anyone who wasn't a Croat, which tended to be defined by being Catholic. Because ethnically there were no real differences between the peoples. So religion became like the identity marker. Yeah, so, in fact, maybe while we're talking about religion, this is interesting. I would say, like, you can't define fascism by its relationship to religion. Like, this is one of the things where you have a lot of variation, and it's not about, like, the most radical fascists are anti-religious, and the less radical fascists are non-religious as such. You can't really, I think, draw any kind of clear line between moderate fascists and more extreme fascists. Because often the ones who were maybe more moderate in their presentation style, who seemed less radical, were actually even nastier when it came to actually killing people and so on. So there's no kind of clear spectrum between like moderate and fascist. That's why I think it's nonsense to talk about the difference between like fascism and authoritarian conservatives. As far as I'm concerned, if they're all kind of extreme, if they're all nationalist, and they're all anti-democratic, well, I mean, I would classify them all as fascists. I say the term conservative should be reserved for, I don't know, Ronald Reagan, Liz Cheney, Margaret Thatcher, you know, like conservatives who stay within the democratic system and so on. Yeah. So religion, one go like democracy. But usually they don't really have much of a blueprint for what they're actually going to put up. So I think this idea of a fascist regime has to look a certain way to be a fascist regime doesn't really work, because none of these leaders know what they were going to do. They were kind of put, like Mussolini, as far as we know, he kind of came to power in the March on Rome, and he became like a sort of semi-constitutional prime minister, because there'd been a little sort of January the 6th kind of vote, this March on Rome. And the king then kind of basically was a whip and sort of then appointed Mussolini prime minister. And Mussolini was actually quite happy for a while being a kind of semi-constitutional prime minister. So he wasn't happy with democracy, but he was doing fine. And he only gets pushed into creating dictatorship when some of his more radical followers murder a socialist member of parliament who's speaking up against him. And at that point, Mussolini's given a choice. he either renounces those guys, and then he's renouncing fascism as well, or he goes all out says, yes, those guys are my guys, and he does that, and then he creates a dictatorship. But there's no kind of blueprint. And even Hitler, I mean, okay, Hitler knew absolutely it wasn't going to be democracy. He hated democracy, weak, squabbling parties, tools of the Jews, you know, all that kind of stuff. But he didn't really have a plan. Like in Mein Kampf, he kind of says it doesn't really matter what the state looks like. So, you know, it's got to be very strong, and you've got to get rid of the Jews, of course, and you've got to conquer a lot of territory. But he don't, and what kind of happens is just once he becomes chancellor, all his followers kind of get incredibly radical. So after years, they feel they've won. So they start taking over all their local organisations, and so it's not entirely Hitler's plan the way the regime emerges. So they're generally anti-democratic, but they don't have like a particular blueprint for it, which I think is quite important. Yeah, what else can I say? I think the basic thing, though, is if I want to produce a really short summary of fascist doctrine, I'd say put maybe at least a Sermon on the Mount or some other great moral text of history and the Declaration of Independence on the board, and I would say not that. Because basically, you know, all, conventional morality says basically it's all about kind of expanding your circle of empathy as far as you can. You don't just love you love your neighbour, but actually everybody is your neighbour. Right? That's, and you know, you do unto others as you do unto you. Confucius said that a long time before it was in the New Testament. And of course, since like the 18th century, people have gradually recognised the basic sort of human equality. I mean, we're not all the same, but we have certain equal rights we all enjoy. Fascism is totally against that. As far as fascism is concerned, life is inevitably about winners and losers. There are people who have power, people who don't have power, and that's good. I mean, there is no good and evil as such. There are winners and losers. It's a very kind of social Darwinist kind of way of them, which is a bit unfair on Darwin, but it's kind of so basically, like, it's survival of the fittest, and the strong will rise to the top, and if they're at the top, they are the strongest, and so they deserve to be at the top. If they're not at the top, they're weak, and at the bottom, they deserve to be at the bottom. And I will say Hitler, for a start, was incredibly consistent about this, because he always said, like, in World War II, if Germany loses this war, then they prove they're weak, and they've given up their right to survive. I won't shed any tears if they're all destroyed. And when it became clear he'd lost the war, he basically gave orders to keep fighting to the very, very last. He had plans to blow up Paris and all kinds of stuff. And he was quite open saying, I have no sympathy for the German people. They failed, they deserve to be destroyed. They were simply weak. And Mussolini's kind of the same. He's all about strength. And it's also connected with like this extreme kind of ultra-masculinity. I mean, okay, being a bit sexist is certainly not just a fascist thing, but fascists push it to a particular extreme, extremely conventional masculinity, women very much, place in the home and so on. I mean, many societies at this time made being a man and gay illegal. That was not, I mean, Oscar Wilde was put in prison for being male and gay. And but sort of fascists, of course, carried that even further. Hitler was putting gay men in concentration camps. Not actually gay women, which have a horrible reason. Right, a horrible feeling is because women don't actually have to enjoy themselves and then to have children. And that's what it's really about for fascists. It's demographics. They tend to be obsessed. We need a really, really big population, so we need to keep pumping out those babies. So we need baby machines and so on. We're going to do that. And they can look after the home. They can worry about the church. Not that we really like the church either, but if somebody has to, why not them? So yes, it's this kind of social Darwinist, winners and losers. And so it's natural that your democracy is for the weak. So what do you have instead? Well, there are lots of different versions. I mean, like in some countries like Hungary in the 1920s, you keep having elections in theory, but you restrict the vote for minority of the population. I mean, I think you could probably argue and say Jim Crow South in some sense would pretty much qualify, because in effect they became a kind of one-party state too, because the Democrats just won every election year after year. They actually ended up dominating the Senate because of that. Because a lot of committees, leadership of committees in Congress was given like personal seniority, and Democrats from the South tended to be incredibly old because they just kept being re-elected time after time and so on. Yeah. So you've got kind of like the, I suppose in that sense, slightly milder forms of fascism where you theoretically preserve a certain amount of political participation, but you limit it to a certain number of people. You could also have like, you have like, in a lot of cases you have like a single party regime of some kind. So kind of, the single party, of course, you never get to actually vote for it or anything, but it becomes a way to control the population. Like you enroll people in all the party youth organisations, the party's women organisations, the party women worker organisations. And the funny thing is, although fascists hate democracy, they love to constantly be told what all people love. So fascism is really characterised by all these public displays, all these big rallies. If you've seen that film Triumph of the Will, so it's a whole, they basically want everybody to love them. They just don't want to give them a chance to prove it by actually, voting for them or anything like that. And so there's always some kind of elite who naturally has the right. So it might be like a minority of the population. In some cases, fascist regimes come apparent in a military coup, and basically the leadership of the military gives its right to kind of govern the nation politically as well. A lot of that these days, of course, too, like Myanmar or Thailand, I would say. But usually there's also like some kind of supreme leader, and there's a personality cult. So Hitler, of course, Mussolini, and these guys, they know what they're doing. They work really, really hard on their image. They spend ages practicing their speech, like Hitler trained, in how to get the gestures right. Mussolini's they're all about presentation, giving razzle dazzle, because they know that's important. And Hitler's clever, like, he knows a lot of the stuff his regime is doing is unpopular, but he kind of avoids being too closely associated with anything that's really unpopular. And an amazing number of Germans kind of says, we hate what this regime is doing, if only the Führer knew. Answer the other question, by the way, or? Oh, I'm sorry, so I thought you only had that one, sorry. So, yes, you have this personality cult, and you have the all-beloved leader, who is assumed to have superhuman abilities. So as Hitler is like the great soldier who kind of came to save the nation, and Mussolini is the great leader. In like also the more conservative kinds of fascism, like you have the Vichy regime in France, and the Vichy regime in France basically turns this senile old war hero from World War I into like his kind of great personality cult leader. It helps, he looks a bit like Santa Claus with his white beard and stuff. He looks good in the uniform. And he kind of preaches, we need a moral regeneration of France. We've been kind of too lax. We've allowed all these weak foreign elements to undermine us. We stopped having babies. That's why we were defeated by the Germans. Now, ironically, these leaders don't themselves tend to live up to their own image. I mean, this guy, his name is Pétain, the guy, the leader of the Vichy regime. He himself had never had any kids. He spent most of his life having just one little casual affair after the other, and eventually he married a divorcee, in fact. So in fact, before World War II, General de Gaulle's wife actually refused to have dinner with Pétain, which he disapproved of. So in a way, Pétain wasn't conservative enough for her. And again, so I mean, Hitler is hardly the kind of blonde-haired, ideally alien race either. So it's not about the reality of it. It's about projecting a certain kind of image. But it does work, because these guys are tapping into a lot of things people are already feeling, like resentment of their country's being brought down somehow, and the need for a strong leader to come and end all this division and stuff. The irony is, of course, although people love the leaders don't love the people. I mean, like, Hitler, as was said, Hitler didn't care what happened to Germany, but German people insisted to achieve his objectives. If they failed, they would destroy it. It's the same with a lot of these other guys. Stalin, too, of course. I mean, he's adored, but I mean, in the end, when he died, nobody dared say he was dead, so they had to send in a cleaning lady to check if he was actually dead. Because, of course, no one wanted to go in and say he was dead, then Stalin was going to wake up somehow, and sort of then accuse him of being traitors, because right to the last, he would send anybody off to a gulag. So they don't love the nation, but the nation loves them. It's this weird kind of one-sided love. I think, what else? Oh yeah, foreign policy. Okay, so this whole idea within your country, you naturally have the strong, you have the weak. It's exactly the same with nations. So, or if you're one of these great nations, you have a right to your own sphere of influence. There's one particular region in the world, it's your natural right to dominate because you're one of the great powers. Like, most fascists aren't normally ambitious to talk about enough. You talk about conquering the whole world straight away. Like even Mussolini, even Hitler was probably thinking mainly of conquering this huge empire of the Soviet Union. I mean, I think at one point Goebbels said that would be enough land for the next 100 years or something like that. And for Mussolini, it's like the Mediterranean. He has this idea that Mediterranean becomes like an Italian sphere of influence. But not all fascist leaders are talking about war and expansion. Like, you've got General Franco, he doesn't talk much about military expansion. There's a guy in Portugal called Salazar, who's also got a personality cult, but he's a little bit more conservative style fascist. And he's not into colonial expansion. You've also got British fascists, including this crazy guy called Oswald Mosley, and he doesn't talk about colonial expansion either. I mean, the guy in Britain is actually one of the few fascists who actually openly says he's a fascist. So why are they not saying we need war and we need to conquer new territory?
The country was already conquered it.
Yeah. These guys have already got bigger empires they can handle. Like Britain's ruling a third of the world after World War I, and quite frankly, it's having trouble holding things together. Like it's ruling places like Iraq and so on, or they're all kind of the Middle East, Africa, Australia and Canada, and in Britain's having enough trouble with colonies. So the British fascists aren't interested in expansion, but they are very interested in keeping the empire Britain already has. And it's the same with Portugal. Portugal's already got a very old colonial empire, and Salazar is very keen on holding that on that empire, because you need to dominate one part of the world, show you all one of these kind of great peoples. So again, I don't think that's a difference between fascists and non-fascists. I think a lot of the differences between the people who are normally called fascists and the people who aren't normally called fascists come down to two things. One is kind of circumstances. It's a matter of how much you can actually get away with. Not everyone's in the same situation. And another thing is kind of, well, what they're on our side. I mean, there's this really horrible Greek dictator called Metaxas in the 1930s who's pretty open about being a huge admirer of Mussolini and Hitler. He's trying to transform the Greek people and make them strong and hard, just like the Italians are apparently supposed to be and the Germans are supposed to be. But he also kind of is very brave in resisting the Italian invasion of Greece during World War II. So I think for that reason, we don't like to include him in the list of fascists. And to be honest, I think there are a lot of leaders in Latin America who I think objectively we should call fascists, and we don't because usually the US and probably my country have pretty good relations. So I think a lot of different fascists and non-fascists. Often people like to use the term authoritarian if they're talking about fascists that they like or don't dislike so much. But it's circumstances, it's not like a real difference. Okay, I mean, then there's capitalism. I mean, what's the fascist view of capitalism?
I think Mussolini said the state and the corporation or something become one, is one thing he said.
Yeah. He said a lot of it. I mean, Mussolini is very big on rhetoric and so on. I mean, and he talks about this thing called corporatism, and so do a lot of other fascists, but they all kind of mean different things by it. And what it tends to mean is, in theory, from now on you're going to have equal representation for workers and big business. They're going to work together, they're going to put aside their conflicts. But in theory, this corporatism always tends to end up giving the bosses all the power and the workers get subordinated. Like, one of the first things fascists do is kind of crush free trade unions as much as they can. So it's kind of like a fight. I mean, fascism is much more pro-capitalist, at least in historic examples, than anti-capitalist. Yeah, go for it.
Wasn't privatization a way to describe Nazi Germany's like leasing of government like business to businesses?
Oh, that's it. I hadn't actually heard of that. That might well be true. I mean, the whole structure of Nazi Germany with like privatization is incredibly weird. Not just business, because people tend to think of like Nazi Germany as being this like totalitarian state where everyone obeys from the top. It's actually incredibly disorganized because basically the state breaks off. Like you've got like Nazis take over parts of the state, and they kind of combine those states with these kind of private organizations they're already running. So that's what happens with the SS. Like Himmler kind of is already the head of the SS, and then he basically takes over the German police as well. It's kind of like he's a sort of like, the state is like an octopus with lots of arms, and Himmler is like a parasite that like attaches onto one of the arms and gradually chews it off. So in the end, you get this thing which is like the Himmler complex, which is like the SS and the police, and Gestapo all together. And it's not exactly private, and it's not exactly public. I mean, in many ways, it's not really a state at all, because for a state in the modern sense, you need the rule of law. And one thing, and if fascists hate democracy, they're no more keen on the rule of law either. Like, I mean, I think there was one case early in Hitler's regime where a court decided something he didn't like, and he said, kind of, this is the last time a German court will find someone innocent that I have found guilty. And yeah, pretty much. I mean, so the courts become completely subordinate. They come up with this kind of legal fiction that, yes, there is the law, but there are circumstances where the will of the people overrides the law. And the will of the people, of course, is Hitler, because Hitler is representing the people. So yeah, so I think, in a general sense, absolutely, it's this weird sort of semi-privatization of the state, including like economic things as well. Like Goering ends up running this huge kind of business empire, which is half private and half public. And in the end, it's kind of like Hitler's like the king, and you've got all these feudal barons who've all got their private empires. And that might sound kind of goofy and crazy. It's actually incredibly radicalizing, because Hitler kind of makes clear in a general sense what he wants. Like, he wants Germany to dominate Europe. He wants the Jews gone. He doesn't really have to go into detail about how he wants the Jews gone, because once he makes it clear that's what he wants, everybody in this state is utterly focused on pleasing him. That's the pathway to rising even higher. So I think when the Holocaust comes, it's not like there's really one blueprint. It's just all these organizations competing to work towards the Führer, as they call it, kind of to anticipate what his will was. It's much more radical than if Hitler had just given orders from the top. So in that sense, I mean, I'd be interested to know more about the precise example you're giving, but in a general sense, absolutely. Oh, so what else? What I should talk about? Yeah. So I mean, you do get a few kind of Nazis a few fascists who kind of call themselves socialists. After what does Nazi stand for? National Socialist. Because it's weird. Like, I think like for them, communism is kind of like the great enemy. Because communism is like, it's kind of on the opposite extreme from them. Communism in theory doesn't believe in the nation at all. It believes in like class conflict. It believes they represent the working class, but nations are just a way of fooling, are just a way of kind of fooling the workers into betraying their true interests. But I think at the same time, there's a sort of grudging respect on both sides. They kind of really admire the other side for being so dangerous and so on. So I think what happens is a lot of fascists start adopting a bit of kind of communist terminology. Like, communists call each other comrade, and so the Nazis start talking about like Volksgenossen, which kind of means ethnic comrades, comrades within the nation and so on. And so I mean, in that sense, there's a sort of superficial talk, but and no, you get like a little bit of welfare kind of stuff in the Nazi state and so on. It's not like absolute free market capitalism. Like, the idea is capitalism has to serve the nation like everybody else does. But as long as they do that, fine, they can make as much profit as they want. And so basically, I think like communism is like the friend and so on. And it's funny actually, I watched that Christian nationalism film I think you guys had, was it last semester or something?
It was fall of 2024. It was a bad faith. Yeah.
Yeah, bad faith, yeah. Yeah, I'm actually going to show that to part of my fascism course, if you don't mind. Yeah, what I found really, really striking about that was one of the guys, I think they were attacking the Capitol, certainly there, it was in that context, they were saying we are Christian Taliban. So I think in many ways, like, radical kind of Islamism has become like the new communism. Like, it's the frenemy, and that kind of like for the Al-Qaeda type people, anybody who is not the right kind of Muslim gets destroyed if they have their way. But in theory, anybody can convert. So in theory, they would actually like to convert the whole world. It's just like communism in theory would like to convert the whole world. And so I think that's become like the new, so for like fascists in America and in other parts of the world, that's become like the new big enemy. Like, one of the reasons Putin comes to power in Russia is because there's there are these wars going on in Chechnya, you know, kind of radical Islamic elements. He kind of uses that as an excuse, you know, to kind of take some very radical measures. And yes, I think there's always you always need some kind of big scary enemy, you know, because otherwise, what's the point of you? So for Nazis, it's particularly the Jews, but also the communists. And as far as Hitler's concerned, it's all kind of the same. And I would say, like, for modern fascists, it's probably like more the Al Qaeda kind of people. So they're the frenemy. Yeah, go for it.
I've seen some interpretation from, if you know Professor Richard Wolff, he was saying, like, Hitler couldn't have not said some socialist rhetoric just because everyone was hot on socialism at the time.
I think there's a lot to that. Like, I mean, I think there was a general feeling after the Great Depression and so on that capitalism in its existing form had failed and so on. So, I mean, yeah, I think right across the world you had kind of more state intervention in the economy. I think to some extent Nazism was kind of going along with that. So was Italian fascism, actually. I mean, for a while, I think, like, the Italian economy under fascism had the biggest proportion of the economy under public ownership, we'll say, but it wasn't anti-capitalist. So such. It was just, I mean, even Roosevelt, I mean, I'm not saying for a moment that Roosevelt was a fascist, but I mean, there was some similarity between some of the New Deal measures and some of what was done by fascist regimes, but they had a very different intention, I would say. Yeah, and other things, yeah, go for it.
The oligarchy. What do all fascist regimes have this kind of sense of an oligarchy?
Yeah, I mean, I think they always have the sense of some kind of elite that has the right to rule.
And does that also include, it's like an oligarchy, but it also has a real kind of nasty racist or ethnic aspect to it where that underclass will never rise. They're never permitted to be in the upper classes.
Yeah, I mean, not in theory so much. Like, I think, like, Hitler in theory was, I mean, Hitler himself was not from the upper class at all. I mean, he was a resentful little guy for a long time. So I think he actually quite liked the idea of the occasional person from the common people rising up, you know, getting to the very top. You know, I guess the Nazi version of the American dream a little bit. And I mean, Napoleon was the same, actually. Like, Napoleon was all about, like, okay, no political democracy, but careers open to talents. He wants, like, his simplest soldier to be able to rise up to the top. But in practice, careers open to talents actually favours people who already have money and education anyway. So basically, you keep the existing conservative system and you let in a few extra people who seem particularly promising. Yeah. So, and I think you do get a lot of people getting incredibly rich out of the regime. I mean, Goering gets incredibly
I was going to ask about is also corruption inherent in these things as well?
I think it certainly tends to be, just because if you give anyone basically limitless opportunities to increase their wealth and power, I think they will, or many people will. I mean, I don't think Hitler himself was personally, well, I don't like to say Hitler wasn't corrupt, but maybe not so much in that particular sense. Like, Hitler actually had quite simple and frugal tastes. Like, he would wear the same tie for years and years until it fell apart, which is not to say I think he was a nice guy, but that wasn't his particular kind of type of vice. Anything else I should say? Oh, what about monarchies and so on? Like, so this is actually the reason a lot of people say that Japan wasn't really fascism, because, well, they had an emperor and so on. But to be honest, I mean, fascist Italy had a king. I mean, Mussolini occasionally ruminated about getting rid of the monarchy, but he never did anything about it. And in the end, he was actually kicked out of power by the king. In Yugoslavia, the fascist dictator was actually the king himself. That Greek guy Metaxas was put in power by the king, just like the Italian king put Mussolini in power. But equally, you've had plenty of fascists in, like, republics as well. Like, Hitler never wanted a monarch. So I think it's kind of, that's an optional thing with fascism. You can be pro-monarchy or anti-monarchy.
And it's similar to, like, with Britain, you would say it's not a democracy because they have a monarchy. The monarchy is there, but it's not, like, they're kind of forcing power and sway.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think in a lot of countries, the monarch's not really the holder of power. It's like a symbol of the political system. And I think for most of Japanese history it's been like that. So, like, the emperor sometimes had power, but for most of the time he's been kind of hidden away a bit in the background. Like, you know, before the Americans arrived in the 19th century, like, Japan was dominated by these shoguns, you know, and so the emperor was kind of marginal and so on. So I think, like, Japan's only, but, like, the emperor is kind of like the seal of approval for whatever regime you get. I mean, I mean, if you say Japan's a monarchy, it's still a monarchy now. I mean, it's yeah, the royal family's still got all. I mean, they've always had the same royal dynasty throughout the whole of their recorded history, which is pretty much unique. So I don't think it really says much about the regime, you know, whether you have monarchy or not. So, yeah, go for it.
What if we have a democracy that doesn't actually function to serve the interests of the people?
That gets into very interesting territory. Yeah. And I think particularly recently, because I think increasingly in recent years, the model has been not so much one single takeover. It's much more a kind of gradual process where you kind of, I mean, I think there are lots of different ways fascism can come to power. Like with Italy and Germany, particularly Germany, you have like a political movement that becomes very, very popular, and then the conservative establishment kind of decides they have to work with this party and so on in order to, they work together to crush democracy. So you have like an alliance between the more radical fascists in this party and the ruling elite. So instead, I would say they're also fascists because they're also nationalists. They're just a more kind of conservative flavour of fascists, maybe. You can also like a military coup, you know, kind of just brings the military. I would say that's totally fascist as well, if it's nationalistic. I mean, the Argentinian military dictatorship in the 70s was horrible, you know. But you could also have a situation where you just have a kind of self-coup within the regime. I think that's what Putin's done. I mean, Putin kind of came to power constitutionally, and just over the years, he's made it more and more impossible for anybody to win an election. Like, technically, you still have elections, but he totally controls the media, and if you criticise him in public too much, you will probably be found dead under a bridge at some point. So I think you have lots of different, and I think like it's an interesting question, how far does a democracy have to deteriorate before it's actually become de facto fascist? Like, you might have, say, like a country that's generally democratic, and one day there's a strike and they kind of send in the police and they use some brutality to oppress it. I would say that's like a flawed democracy. But if that's been repeated many times, maybe, and that party begins to monopolise more and more power, control the media, I think then you can have like this slow path to fascism. I think a lot of countries have gone that way. You know, I think Hungary was going that way. I think in the end, just that leader just became so unpopular with everybody, you know, that he just couldn't sustain it. But I think that was what he was trying to go for. So I think you could certainly have an interesting discussion about how far can a democracy deteriorate and still be a flawed democracy, as opposed to, or what about like Jim Crow? I mean, like, in theory, everybody could vote in Jim Crow South. You just had to pass certain tests. And it just so happened that those tests tended to discriminate against, shall we say, certain kinds of people. And I would say, like, I would say you could have like a little bit of, you could have a little bit of unfair elections and still be a flawed democracy. But if you have systematic exclusion of a whole group of people, I think at that point you're not a democracy anymore. So yeah, absolutely. Does that kind of answer what you were?
Yeah, what if you systematically disenfranchise the entire working class for the benefit of the ruling class?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's pretty much what happened in Hungary, actually. Hungary was weird because the Hungarian dictatorship came to power even before fascist Italy did. Like, I think it was back in 1920. There was like a sort of brief communist revolution in Hungary, and it got crushed by the forces of the right, who then kind of got rid of democracy too. And that guy's got no model, so he doesn't actually call himself a dictator. He says he's a regent for the king, except Hungary doesn't have a king anymore. And every time the ex-king tries to come back, he doesn't let him come back. But Hungary kind of theoretically is reversing to an older stage of its constitution when only some people could vote. So effectively, yeah, it is disenfranchising a big part of the population. So yeah, I would say certainly, yeah. Or if you have a regime that stopped women voting, I mean, I think that would definitely qualify too. Yeah, go for it.
What role does religion play in fascism?
Oh yeah, I'm sorry. Thanks for reminding me. I think it depends a lot. I mean, my personal feeling, which a lot of people might have good reason for disagreeing with, is that kind of true Christianity is all about sort of universal compassion, and kind of, and there's no difference between people in different nations. You should love everybody. I mean, many Christians have not lived up to that. But I think in theory, kind of Christianity is kind of a universal religion of kind of compassion, loving the weak, and that's actually completely incompatible with fascism. And a lot of fascists know that Hitler, I think, described Christianity as that Jewish Christ creed with its effeminate pity ethics. Like, he kind of believes in sort of God or providence, but it's like it's a kind of force of nature that wants the strong to win, and so on. So Hitler is no Christian at all. Martin Bormann, I think, said Jesus was a cowardly Jewish lout who had a few adventures during his years of indiscretion. But, on the other hand, they're ruling a country where most people are still conventionally Catholic or Protestant. And so they know they can't say this stuff too loudly. So they're only too happy to kind of identify what they claim is positive Christianity. So in public, they're all about kind of Christianity. And sadly, you do have a lot of voters who are Christian that see that as being very compatible with being extreme nationalist, being authoritarian. So, same with Mussolini. Like, Mussolini, he kind of loves saying stuff like, he loves sort of cursing Jesus and then saying, if God is there, may he strike me dead. I guess God got round to it in the end, although it took his time. But in public, he also knew that, like, the Catholic Church was a huge part of Italian culture. And I think that, like, fascists are often okay with religion. In fact, you even get some fascists who are actually very religious, like Romanian fascists, very weird bunch. I mean, their form of fascism is so religious, it's been called, like, heretical branch of Christianity. And I think what it is like, strictly speaking, if you see Christianity as like a universal thing, it's not compatible with fascism. But if you see it as being just part of your national identity, it's just part of a national package that separates you from other people, then it's totally compatible with fascism. Yeah, go for it.
This might be a touch too far back, but Napoleon brought back the church after the French Revolution. Would that, along with would Napoleon be considered a fascist?
Yeah, and it's interesting, he did bring back the church, and when he has his coronation, like a nice bishop is standing there, but he places the crown on his own head, which is interesting. So, like, the church is there, but he's not going to let it cramp his style. So, to be honest, I often ask myself, to be honest, the only answer I can come up with, I think if Napoleon had been living in the 20th century, he would totally have been a fascist. I would say it's just a completely different kind of society back in Napoleon's time. Like, you're not into the age of real, despite the revolution, you're not into, like, mass politics and so on. You're not into the era where everybody has an action figure of themselves. You know, there's kind of, you don't have mass media in the modern sense. I would say that's the only reason Napoleon doesn't qualify as a fascist, to be honest.
To continue that, what role does militarism and separately the military-industrial complex have in the foundations of fascism? Or what's the definition of fascism?
Really good point. Thanks for bringing it up. I mean, I think virtually all fascists love to cultivate a military style. You know, they love the uniforms, they love the parades and so on, all that kind of stuff. And very often when they come to power, they come, like, part of the kind of conservative establishment that helps them come to power includes, like, the top-ranking military and so on. Like, usually they have an idea, we want, like, a strong leader who's going to crush those nasty socialists, and let us have as big an army as we want. So they kind of make a deal with the fascists. They help the fascists come into power. Usually then they end up regressing it in the end, but the trouble is that by the time it becomes clear Hitler's going to lose, they become so complicit that it's very difficult to kind of pull out of a relationship. So I think that's probably a little bit what's happened with, say, some of the Christian nationalists in America, to be honest. I think kind of like, at first they weren't too enthusiastic about Trump, but I think they've had to become so because they've reached a point where they simply can't pull out of that relationship. I think complicity is very dangerous, not just Christian nationalists, but anybody who thinks you can kind of make a deal with this guy. He'll give you the things you want if you just go along with him, because at a certain point, if you give someone a blank check, they're going to use it. You might not like what they do with it. So yeah, I don't think fascism is ever just like the puppet of the military-industrial complex, but it certainly has like a cozy relationship with it a lot of the time. Yeah. Go for it.
So talking about like the sort of heuristics of defining when something is fascist. So, you know, you gave the two nationalist and authoritarian. I think some, at least self-proclaimed communist-leaning things could be called that. Are those mutually like incompatible, or is that not the case? You mentioned Stalin earlier.
North Korea, right?
North Korea, you'll be a great example, modern maybe.
Do you guys mind if I draw a little diagram on the board? And I do apologise to you guys, you've seen it most of the time. Okay, like the conventional way of doing this is kind of like left to right, right? There's a line from left to right. This goes back to the French Revolution where the deputies who were more radical sat on like the left side of the chamber, the ones who were close to the king sat right. And ever since then, we tend to choose this left-right line. I think it's actually more of a circle. So this is why I was never very good at geometry when I was a kid. Yeah. So what have you got, like, shall we say? Now, this is a huge oversimplification, so any political science people feel free to shoot me down. That's an error. Errors always look good in the diagram, but if you draw errors, they do. Okay, so this is kind of how I see it. So, yes, on the bottom you've got like the whole democratic spectrum. So I guess anybody who kind of plays by the democratic rules of the game. So basically in American terms, I guess Liz Cheney to Bernie Sanders, or something like that. And probably a few other guys as well. And then you got, and then if you go, the more you go kind of initially to the right, and then up, the more you're going more nationalist, more kind of entirely focused on one group of human beings. The more you go that way, the more universalist you are. So the less you're interested in the nation, and the more you're interested in like some kind of universal collective, which could be like communism, or it probably could be radical Islam and so on as well. And we're kind of, I guess, in the middle. I hope I can speak for all of you guys. I say, well, we're kind of in the middle because we both believe in kind of like loyalty for nation, but also we have like universal human values and stuff. So we're kind of in the middle. And for what it's worth, it generally also tends to go not absolutely always so, but it's usually. Yeah, so where would you guys put fascism on that little circle I just drawn?
I'd probably shoot on the right side. I'd probably go halfway up the circle on the right side or somewhere around there.
Okay. So would I, that sounds great. Yeah, so let's say democracy stretches about there. It does cover a pretty wide spectrum, but then you've got this going a pretty long way up. And I would call this, it's funny, when I was a kid you were either autistic or you're not autistic in a very old-fashioned way. These days, of course, you talk about the autistic spectrum, which is much more of me. And I would say you've got the fascist spectrum as well. Which is not trying to make any kind of connection at all between in Euro and typical is a superpower, although of course as every Marvel movie viewer knows, not every superpower person uses their powers for good. But it's a superpower nonetheless. And yes, I would say there's this whole spectrum. So kind of like it's further on the right than democracy, kind of it's, and usually speaking also, I'll add one more detail. You know, so if you're like, I think if you're in like the democracy section, you all agree that everyone should be equal in certain ways, like equal voting rights, equal human rights. But if you're on the right of the democratic spectrum, you tend to feel the government should do less to create more equality. So like political equality and like human rights equality is enough. Whereas if you're on the socialist side end of the democratic spectrum, you're thinking the state should do more to kind of intervene and so on. And communism, although in practice Stalin was rather different from that, is theoretically is about total equality for everyone, like the abolition of all kind of hierarchies and so on. Fascism, on the other hand, is like the most extreme kind of version of hierarchy is inevitable, and that's great. We need it. You know, life is unequal. You know.
I'm just trying to have a complete picture. What would go like the left side? Like what kind of society would be?
I guess I'd be thinking of maybe, do you know like the Red Army faction in Germany? You know, you get these, they were known by their, people who didn't like this, like the Bader-Meinhof gang. Do you have these people who were they were very committed to kind of being anti kind of oppression and anti kind of like capitalism, anti the establishment. And they went so far, I think they kind of completely lost touch. And so they became like the big terrorist threat in Germany. So maybe somebody who's not kind of as authoritarian as a conservative, but they kind of abandon democratic methods. Like if you have some kind of like radical person who says we should abolish democracy and replace it with like syndicalism, some kind of trade unions, so maybe that might be. So sort of very radical left people who aren't quite communist, but they're not exactly democratic either. Of course, when I say democracy, that's shorthand for indirect democracy, representative democracy. I mean, I guess we're never going to have Athenian-style democracy, where we all go to Congress. And even that wasn't that good anyway, if you're a woman or a slave. So, yeah, go.
So what is the Supreme Court decision from yesterday? Essentially, how would that? Where does that steer us on this?
Which particular Supreme Court decision are we talking about? There's been so many recently.
So they essentially scaled back to the Voting Rights Act, where they essentially, I think the decision. Someone else who might know more about this can correct me, but it seems to me that the decision was that you can't create districts to protect underrepresented populations. Essentially overturning that. So
I think that's very dangerous. I mean, in my personal opinion, I think don't get me wrong, I am all in favour of America leading the global world order. I mean, America's not perfect, but I would much, much rather have America in charge of the world than any of the other candidates for the job. China, no thanks. Putin's Russia, no thanks. And NATO and and it's not been perfect, but there has been some kind of rules-based international order for the last few decades and so on. And I think we throw that away at our peril. But I think America itself only became fully democratic in 1965 with the Voting Rights Act. I think before that, any era under Jim Crow didn't really fully qualify as democratic. So that was I think the Voting Rights Act was a huge move towards democracy. And I think what's happened sort of since the time of Obama is that's gradually been whittled away and eroded away and so on. And that worries me a lot, because I think one day we could just wake up maybe it wouldn't look exactly the same as Jim Crow, but we could kind of gradually get back to something like that. So that worries me a lot. I mean, generally, I think the position of the Supreme Court is incredibly dangerous, because it will take years to replace those guys. I mean, even if we have a change of president and so on. And I think in about 90% of cases, they tend to back sort of Trump's claim to kind of more and more presidential powers and so on. I mean, for freedom from prosecution for anything he does as president and so on. I mean, I don't think I would call Trump in his first term entirely a fascist. I would have said he had some very dangerous tendencies, but he was too constrained by the system at that point. And he hadn't yet flat out come out and tried to overturn an election like he did later on. But I think when he was, I think being out of power for a term was a huge advantage for him. Like, it gave him time to completely solidify his control over the Republican Party, which hadn't been anything that strong kind of when he was president for the first time. It allowed all his little minions to build up their plans like Project 2025 and all that kind of stuff. So I think in many ways you could compare like the failure of January the 6th and Trump being out of power. It's a bit like when Hitler tried to launch a coup in 1923 and he was then excluded from any chance of power for a while. That gives him the chance to totally dominate the Nazi party. But when he does have his chance again, he can be an even more extreme dictator. And I think...
Because to follow, kind of, I don't know much about Hitler, but the fact that Trump kind of continued a shadow presidency in the sense that he continued to deal with foreign leaders. You know, he was still, it wasn't like Jimmy Carter, you know, went back to peanut farming in Plains, Georgia, you know, and started building houses. You know, Trump was still actively courting relationships with foreign powers to Biden's detriment in the sense that he had to worry about this meddling that was going on.
Yeah. I mean, that worries me a lot. I mean, there just seems to be this kind of, I don't know what you put, yes, maybe about sort of like 40% of the electorate or so, which seems to be pretty much willing to follow Trump off a cliff and so on, if you ask me. I mean, I'm not saying all Republicans are like that. I mean, I know some very decent people who would consider themselves Republicans who don't like anything that's going on at the moment. But I think that as long as he's got that kind of like 40% of the country behind him, which incidentally is not that different from the highest share of the vote Hitler ever got in a fair and free election in Germany. As long as he's got that, he can basically bend the Republican Party to his will. I mean, there were plenty of like leaders after January 6th who would have been quite happy to dump Trump, but it became very clear from their voters they weren't going to have that, so they all ended up going off to Mar-a-Lago and kissing the ring and so on. So I mean, yeah, I mean, somehow I think we have to sort of break that group's kind of loyalty to Trump, or it somehow has to be kind of dissolved, or I mean, and I guess a lot of it's kind of is like what Hitler support. It's not all kind of just support for Hitler. It's kind of, it ties into a lot of stuff historically going back a long way. Like I guess for a certain number of people who never wanted Jim Crow to go away in the first place. And I think, and Trump is like, he's been like a time bomb. I mean, he's building up for years like that stupid TV show they gave him, The Apprentice, which kind of established his reputation as being this kind of activist business genius, while in fact he never really made money on any business anymore. I mean, the only thing he's ever been good at, not unlike Hitler, well, actually maybe two things. I think they both, I'm not trying to say that Trump is like Hitler, he's not exactly the same, but there are similarities too. And I mean, I think they're both very good, A, appealing to the dark side of human nature. Because I think for them, basically, the dark side of human nature is human nature. You know, they don't really see. And on the other hand, they're very good at selling and marketing a certain image of themselves. And I think and when you've got a big group of the population who are already quite inclined to agree with a lot of what you're saying, that's very, very powerful. I mean, I think in that sense, Trump's kind of like a charismatic leader like Hitler was. So if anything looks like it's going to become too unpopular, he tends to disassociate himself as fast as he can. He needs to keep this kind of charismatic popularity he's got. Just like Hitler tried not to become too involved in everything the Nazi regime was doing. Might be annoying people at a local level. So. And I mean, some people would say, I think, that Trump isn't a fascist because he's not really about any ideas. He's all about himself. You know, he's just I actually don't quite buy that. Like, let's go back to churches for a minute. Like, if you walk into like a church, you'll have some people in that room who kind of write books about theology. You know, they kind of have this incredibly intellectual view of their faith. You'll have some people in the room who don't have an intellectual view of their faith. They see it quite simple, but they believe every word of it. Then you'll have some people who believe about 75% of it. You'll have some people who believe about 50% of it. And you'll have some people who don't really believe in too much of any of it, but they kind of think, well, it's bringing people together, you know, it's kind of good family values and stuff. And you'll probably even have the occasional person who doesn't believe anything at all, but he knows his boss goes to the same church, so he wants to be there. And I think like a political ideology is just the same. You get kind of But in the end, they all belong to that church in a certain sense. And I think kind of Hitler, Trump is a much less intellectual kind of fascist than Hitler or Mussolini. I think Mussolini had certain pretensions to be like a big intellectual and so on. And Trump, I think it's much more of a matter of instinct with Trump and so on. But I think there is an ideology. There's like the social Darwinist thing, absolutely. Like the idea, there are winners and losers. There is no good and evil. I mean, that's why he thinks Russia should win in Ukraine. Because if he were a Ukrainian, he would just give up because Russia is stronger. So why shouldn't Ukraine give up? And the world should be split up between certain big countries with their spheres of influence, which is a very fascist. Go for it.
They also explained his attitude with veterans who were like POWs or got born in combat, where he's like, they're just losers.
Yeah.
It's the same kind of like, well, they lost, so who cares what happened?
Yeah, I mean, on the one hand, you have this kind of attempt to really identify with the military, but it's just kind of used again and so on, yeah. I mean, and it's all about winning. I mean, I think in a lot of ways, he's much more like Mussolini than Hitler. Like, he doesn't have this kind of overwhelming anti-Semitic hatred that Hitler had, but he does have this love of success and power. Like, I mean, I couldn't tell you exactly why Trump got involved in this thing in Iran, but I suspect a lot of it was he just felt like Israel was on a winning streak, so he better just join in and take a share in all the winning and all the glory and stuff. And, go for it.
So if we have this circle, I'm really curious what is above fascism but before Leninism, and then maybe like where we could plot China, maybe during Mao, maybe Deng Xiaoping and Xi Jinping.
I'm really glad you brought that up. I would probably pretty close, but I'd put, Stalinism. Because I think, as all the evidence suggests, he always remained committed to like the idea of a universal communist revolution, sometimes but he was very willing to harness nationalism to get what he wanted. Like, he compared himself to like great czars of the past and so on. And he was like, Soviet Union was very much like a sort of Russian empire. And yes, he's kind of on the edge. And I would say,
sorry to distract. Did he? I don't know enough about Stalin. Did he try to suppress the church, or did he use the church? Like Hitler used the church, tapping into that in order to use the nationalism. Did Stalin do the same, or did he try to? Because we always hear that Stalin was an atheist, et cetera, and but is that true? What's the?
I don't think he ever kind of was claimed to be as positive about the church as Hitler did, because Hitler had an interest in appearing like the guardian of Christian values. But I think that Stalin was certainly very willing to use the church when it suited him, like particularly once World War II started. So, and to be fair, I mean, he knew that the Soviet Union had to win the war against Germany, and they did pay the bigger price than anyone else winning World War II, so we have to give them that. And I think in the war he was increasingly willing to harness kind of forces of traditional Russian patriotism, because he knew that communism wasn't really enough in itself, and that certainly included the church a bit. So I don't think he ever really kind of talked about like Christianizing communism, but he was certainly very prepared to kind of like work with the church. Kind of the same with China. I mean, I think in China there's like a sort of official church which is approved by the regime, although the regime is secular, and there's like an unofficial church and so on. And I think there are always negotiations about maybe unifying like the official church and the unofficial church and all that kind of stuff. So I think it's kind of like it's a pragmatic relationship, but if it's in their interests. Talking of China, I would put China in the fascist spectrum. Because, I mean, I think actually, in some ways, it's one of the most radical forms of fascism, because usually fascism had to come to power by having some kind of alliance with established elites and so on, who were a bit more conservative. Whereas in China, they just won the civil war flat out. So, I mean, you still have, like, local bureaucrats and so on, but they had the most uncompromising path to power. And I think what happened is, initially they start out as being theoretically part of world communism and so on. But I think Mao, it was a bit like Mussolini started out as theoretically being an international socialist, but I think for Mao it was always really about China's national regeneration and so on. And once they kind of split with the Soviet Union, I mean, you never hear these days about China promoting world revolution. You hear about China promoting China. And they tend to kind of insist very much on the loyalty of ethnic Chinese people everywhere because they're all part of the Chinese nation. And they want Taiwan because they claim it's historically part of the Chinese nation. So I would say China's actually, I think there are two paths to fascism. You can have conservatives going mad, or you can have communists discovering the joys of nationalism. I think that's what's happened with and also, of course, they've forgotten all about being anti-capitalist, of course, too. China was all in favour of capitalism as long as it doesn't step out of line. So.
Yeah. I was thinking like, I was trying to map it on here. I was thinking maybe Mao himself could have been, or maybe the revolution around him could have been on the left side, and then around Deng Xiaoping sort of just bridge straight over. Does that sort of, what are your thoughts on that bridge idea?
Yeah, that's an interesting idea. Could be. I mean, I'm still inclined to think that Mao is basically kind of too nationalist. I mean, it doesn't take him long to break with the Soviet Union. So I think he's just always looking for some way of making China great again and so on. For a while, that seems to be like an alliance with the Soviet Union. You want to join up with a big sort of power you can work with, but I mean, maybe kind of economic, but to be honest, I think actually it's not really about economics. I mean, I think economics are important, but I think in the end, economics isn't really what defines people a lot of the time. It's much more how they see the world. Like, people always talk about, like, the Weimar Republic fell because, like, the German economy was ruined by reparations and the Versailles Treaty and the Great Depression. But in fact, the Germans actually never paid many reparations. They kept resisting pay. And all that stuff with like the inflation where they were carrying their money around in wheelbarrows, that wasn't caused by reparations. That was caused by trying to avoid paying reparations. Because basically, that was part of Germany that got occupied by the French to make sure they paid the treaty. The German government wanted them to do passive resistance to resist the French. So they decided, we're going to pay you guys for doing no work. So they started printing money on a massive scale. And that's actually what ruins the German economy. It's not actually so much. So I think in the end, it's kind of, Hitler doesn't come to power because of economics primarily. It's kind of a greed nationalism, like a kind of a self-indulgence. So I mean, I know it might seem a bit naive to kind of just have everything in terms of politics, but I think it kind of works. Go for it.
Do you think there's anything bad about being nationalistic by itself?
Well, I guess it would depend sort of how you define nationalism. I think
If you had like a democratically elected leader that just wanted in what he said the best for his country, and then only talk about in terms of like the country getting better, but didn't take over like complete power, like work inside the bounds of democracy.
I think a lot of that I would maybe call patriotism, and I think that can be great. In fact, I think it works very well if people in the country have a pride in their country and so on. I think the best thing is when you're proud of your country for all the good things it's done, but you're also willing to acknowledge like the bad things your country has done and so on. I mean, that's true greatness, you know, when you see the good side and the bad, and you're still proud of your country for all the good stuff, but it's like, you know, when you grow up, you think your parents are perfect, maybe, and at a certain point you realise that they're flawed human beings like anyone else, but you still love them. And I think that's great. I mean, if it's kind of like love of country, I think that can be great, as long as you're loving everyone in your country and it's not just a way of excluding certain people. I mean, I think nationalism tends to be more a bit like, you put your nation first, but you somehow think your nation doesn't really exist fully. It's become decadent. You've got to kind of restore your nation. And that can be positive. Like if you're some kind of nationalist liberation movement, like freeing yourself from foreign rule, that could be good. But it's always got a tendency to exclude people and so on. So I would say like patriotism is great, generally speaking. Nationalism, not so much. Does that sound right to you?
That sounds good. And then I was wondering, like, in modern day, or you did say, I guess in the 20th century that it normally involved racism, at least that tended to go along with fascism. But in like Russia or the United States today, how would you say that's happening?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you don't hear much about kind of anti-black people nationalism in Russia, basically because there were no black people in Russia. I mean, I think I read some memoirs of some German communists who actually he used to spend time hanging out with the only black guy in Moscow or something like that. I mean, I think racism is, I mean, every form of fascism is influenced by national traditions. So
I was wondering about like current day Russia underneath like Putin's regime.
oh, absolutely racist.
Who are the racists? I just haven't heard much about it or how like who they would be because it's mainly influenced, the same Russia.
I think that nationalism in Russia tends to be particularly directed at like the people who were formerly like the subjects of the Russian Empire, like Kazakhs or Chechens and so on. And I mean, you don't tend to hear too much about kind of anti-black nationalism, for example, because Putin's interesting. Like on the one hand, when he's talking to like say MAGA kind of people, he will emphasize, I am traditional European culture, I'm about restoring Christianity, and Putin kind of makes a big thing of kind of like representing the church and so on. He's got all his old KGB buddies and now running the Orthodox Church in Russia and all that. But at the same time, Putin also, to some people who used to like the Soviet Union for being anti-colonialism, he's kind of quite capable of playing, well, actually, I am still the Soviet Union. I think he kind of does that quite cleverly and so on. So you aren't going to hear too much about being sort of anti-black people because they're very interested in gaining influence in Africa and so on. And to be fair, I mean, like the West did do some terrible things in Africa in its time, so it wouldn't really be very strategic for Putin to start talking about, sort of inferiority of black people. But I think it's certainly there.
How about others? So, like, how about homosexuals? Other kind of hot button social issues that they can kind of push in order to kind of harken back to the good old days, sort of a thing.
I think it's pretty similar to Weimar Germany in a lot of ways. Like, it's just this kind of sense of humiliation. Like, I mean, I'm no expert on Putin. We have someone in the room who's more of an expert on Putin than me. I think there are certain parallels between Putin and Hitler in the sense that when they grow up under rather wild circumstances, like Putin's a bit of a gangster and so on, growing up in St. Petersburg. And then he finds a purpose in serving the Soviet regime, and he becomes a very proud member of the KGB, and he kind of goes off and he's serving in the KGB in East Germany, and then one day, basically, the Soviet Union collapses. And I think that's a horrible humiliation. That destroys everything he believed in. And I think to a certain extent, he's trying to get back to the glory days of the Soviet Union. Because I think somebody said, if you want to understand how somebody sees the world, think how the world looked when they were a teenager. And like when he was maybe a teenager, like the Soviet Union was maybe in its kind of relative golden age, they got men into space before America did. It looks quite impressive for a while. So I think he's not a communist anymore economically, but he wants to get back to those glory days of the good old Russian Empire. And I think a lot of people in the country have been inclined to feel that too, sadly, because from their perspective, okay, you had the Soviet Union, what happened then? Total economic collapse in the 1990s, like the inflation in Germany, so why don't we have a strong leader? And okay, he hasn't really fixed the economy's still miserable, but at least he's making us feel powerful.
So it's kind of an internalized humiliation that often comes upon when there's really rapid social change. It makes the population very uncertain.
I think there's a lot to that. And I will say that I think it was, in some ways, it was quite bad timing. I think when not in a certain sense, it was quite bad timing when the Soviet Union fell, because it came at the moment when people were at that absolute maximum level of confidence that capitalism could just solve everything. So I think after the economic crisis of 2008, we came back on that a bit. But I think like the 90s, with communism falling, it just felt like kind of capitalism was the solution to everything. So basically, you had a lot of Americans, other capitalists heading off to Soviet Union, and they say, what you need to do is just introduce capitalism, privatize everything, kind of. And what happens is a huge amount of wealth just gets concentrated in the hands of oligarchs and so on. And I think if America and Europe had been more like a New Deal kind of frame of mind, maybe they wouldn't have been pushing so much as because I don't think capitalism alone is enough. I think capitalism can be a good thing if it's checked and balanced. I think almost anything is good in itself, but you just need checks and balances for everything. But if you have just totally unrestrained capitalism imposed on like a society that's just been communist, you're not going to get some kind of democracy. You're going to get this horrible oligarchy with a lot of poverty and everyone's feeling humiliated and stuff like that. So, Go.
Would total wartime America kind of be on like the edge of the left of democracy? I'm trying to think of governments that might fit the left side of the circle. Lincoln kind of cracked down on a lot of the criminal rights or incarcerated rights.
Habeas corpus and that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and the reasonings of like spreading democracy to Europe by Woodrow Wilson and Kinley, and even like up to World War II, where with a lot of the alphabet soup programs and the wartime, like doing things for the American military, not exactly necessarily for the company you work for. If that makes sense, because a lot of social change happened during these events. Even though it was usually internal, not where it wasn't conquered. But would that be an example of somewhere on the left side of that?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think it's certainly true that like total war doesn't bring out the best in democracy anywhere. So, like say in World War II, you got like the internment of Japanese and so on. And ironically, in World War I, it's German Americans who are in trouble because you have kind of like this 100% American movement that sort of tried to force all German people to change sauerkraut's name to Liberty Cabbage, and there's all kinds of So I would say, if anything, maybe kind of in terms of economic controls, like maybe America kind of goes a bit more state planning, like a lot of the world does. But in many ways, I say that's actually quite right-wing in a lot of ways, because it's kind of like focusing on keep out the enemy, even the enemy who's already in your country and stuff, And it goes together with a lot of anti-communism as well, once once Stalin is no longer our friend and so on. So I would say, I guess maybe, I would say like Scandinavia, for example. Now, I'm not saying Scandinavia is not democratic. I would love to live in Scandinavia. So, I'm very happy here. I would say Scandinavia is maybe on the outermost edge of democracy because it is capitalist. It has some really successful companies being bigger. What's a bigger multinational map? But I think Scandinavia is very socialist by the standards of democracy. Maybe I'll put that kind of there. Yeah, just maybe like if you had maybe some of those regimes in post-independence Africa that kind of embrace a sort of authoritarian socialism, but it's not exactly communism. To be honest, this is the next thing I want to think about, was where like post-independence African regimes fit into this, because a lot of them are dictatorships. Some of them are quite nationalistic, so are they fascist? Well, give me some time to think about that. Yeah, maybe like someone like, there's this guy called Nyerere in Tanzania who's all about, he doesn't like democracy, it's a kind of form of socialism, but it's not as authoritarian as communism. Maybe they go on that side, I guess. But at least as far as I'm
We're coming up on like 90 minutes. So I want to thank Dr. Peaple for giving us his time and his knowledge. And if we want to continue the conversation, that's perfect. But keep the recording relatively brief. I'll cut the recording part, and then if we want to continue the conversation, you're welcome to. But thank you, Dr. Peaple. I appreciate it.
Thank you. I really appreciate all the comments and feedback.